Hello everybody. Welcome to Creating the Basic Adaptable Game Engine Library, Part 20, Input Class Design. In the previous video, we finished our game class, and it's able to create a window for us, and we've connected it to the sprite class so we can draw sprites in the canvas in our game window. However, we do not yet have control over those sprites, and all games have some element of interactivity with them. So in this video, we will create an input class which will monitor for keyboard input and effectively allow us to control and move sprites around the screen in our games. So let's talk a little bit about how input classes need to work. First, we'll just talk about handling keyboard input in the class right now. In a future video, we will someday talk about handling mouse input. But for now, just keyboard input. And really, there's two different types of events you might see in games: discrete events and continuous events. For example, if you were jumping, that occurs at one instant in time. A continuous event would be something like walking or running that occurs during an interval of time. So for a discrete event, that usually happens the moment you press a key. And a continuous event, that usually happens as long as you're holding down a key. So there are these two qualitatively different kinds of input that we need to be able to deal with. However, most computer languages will only monitor for discrete events: the moment you press a key down and the moment you release a key and it goes back up. That's also the case with JavaFX. It's actually the scene class which will monitor the discrete events, and that'll be important shortly. One potentially complicating factor is that input events are handled asynchronously, kind of like an interrupt. You can set up your program so that when the computer detects a user input event, a certain function is called. However, that function or that key press probably won't line up with the exact instant that you're monitoring or checking for a key press in your update function. And therefore, in the input class, what we'll do, the approach we'll take, is whenever a key is just pressed or just released, we'll go ahead and add it to a queue and then process it later at a time of our choosing. We'll use an update function to handle that. In addition, storing these results of these discrete events in a queue will help us to process continuous events. Right? A continuous event, a key is pressed down during the period of time after the key is initially pressed, but before the key is released. So we can also use the results of the discrete events to handle and store the continuous events as well. And one thing which can make this a little bit complicated, especially if you program in multiple languages, is that there really seems to be no standard notation for keyboard events. Right? The moment you press a key down, sometimes that's called a key press event. Sometimes that's called a key down event. Especially if you're switching between, say, maybe Java or JavaScript or Python in the Pygame library, you have to be very aware of which words are used. Sometimes key press refers to that moment you press a key down. Sometimes key press only applies to actual physical characters that appear on the screen. It can be very confusing, so just be very careful with your terminology. So in this library, in the Basic Adaptable Game Engine library, we'll say that a key is just pressed or just released to refer to these discrete events, and we'll say a key is pressed or still pressed to refer to these continuous events. Before diving into the code, as always, I'd like to start off by taking a look at the Java doc, which will tell us what the different methods are we are about to create. So let's switch over to that. And here is our input class. And right now it's just for updating the keyboard state. Now let's take a look at the different fields. Right, there's going to be a number of different array lists. In fact, I'm going to keep track of 5 different lists altogether. And I just personally like using the array lists. So first, we'll have the queues for just pressed keys and just released keys. Whenever that asynchronous processing happens, whenever the scene realizes that a key has just been pressed or just released, we will add the names of the keys to these corresponding lists. I like to think of them as queue because they're waiting to be processed later. We are still using a list data structure, not a queue data structure. And then, when we run an update method later on, it'll take whatever information is stored in these queues and convert to these lists. Right? The just pressed list will store all the keys which had been pressed since the previous iteration of the update function. Still pressed will contain the names of all keys that were pressed but not yet released. And just released, that list will keep track of the names of the keys which were just released. We'll also have functions which will query the contents of each one of these lists. It'll ask by name. The constructor for this class, well, it's going to need to take one parameter, the scene, which will be active in our game window, because the scene is actually what processes the keyboard input. We'll also have to remember to create an update function, and that will update the contents of all the lists based on what has been added to the queues. And we'll make sure this is automatically called by the game class. Now, within our games, we'll use these functions to determine the states of different keys. So for example, if you have a discrete event such as, jumping, a character jumping, or maybe, firing a laser, you might use the isKeyJustPressed method. And it'll take in the name of the key. And the way JavaFX works, the names of the keys are strings like left for the left arrow key, capital letters for the letter keys. The number keys, those are digit followed by the actual digit. The spacebar key is space. You can also query for meta keys like shift and control and alt. And this will return true if a key was just pressed. IsKeyPressed will be used for continuous events. And again, that takes the name of a key. And isKeyJustReleased, well, that could be used for game actions like, maybe you're holding down a button to charge a laser and then you want to release the key and then the laser fires at that moment in time. So isKeyReleased could be used for discrete events like that. All right, that's an idea of what's going to go on within the input class. And in the next video, we'll turn our attention to actually creating the input class. Thanks for watching.